I know Dan really well. I've gone many trips with him. We just came back from Africa together. And even in Africa, at the president's meeting with Ruto, he says, hey, I was a wirer for the Grateful Dead.
Okay.
Right there in front of all the ministers of Kenya. That's what he said. Now, believe it or not, this is his down deep satisfaction. So I've invited to sort of like litmus test all this Steve Parish. Steve Parish is a dear, dear friend of mine for over 25, 30 years. And Steve was the manager of the Grateful Dead. He manages Jerry Garcia's band. He's been with the band ever since the band started. He was their chief logistic roadie. He's the one that engineered the wall of sound that we see here in '74. This is not the Barton concert at Cornell, that was one of the more famous ones in '77.
Thank you.
I can't talk yet. And so I want to introduce Steve, and Steve's going to give us some more background, and then we'll get into some more explorations about the Grateful Dead and Dan Kammen, truth or fantasy. Okay, Steve, come on.
Are you ready for me?
I am ready for you. I have introduced you. Go for it.
Hello, everybody. I stand before you. I always say to everybody, I'm the luckiest guy in the world. In 1968, when I came to San Francisco, immediately I fell in with the Grateful Dead. By just an act of kindness, helping a guy unload a truck, opened up this entire career for me. I was only 18, and so Jerry Garcia, we'd all meet at where we worked for Owsley. Owsley was a chemist of his own self-teaching. He was also a ballet dancer. He'd been in the Navy, he'd been in the Air Force. He was a super genius, and we all were. That's how it worked. And so Jerry wanted to play every night in nightclubs. And so Ramrod, who was the guy I helped unload a truck that day, opened up every door for me. He'd come down with the pranksters, and I'd fallen into this world that I realized was everybody's dream in 1968. It's just as crazy as it is now in those days. So when you realize that PAs were just the same as you had in every movie theater, they were called A1 bottoms. They had a 12-inch speaker and a big box around it. And that was what, when you went to shows like Woodstock and all those places where we started, you're looking out at a million people and you got these tiny little boxes. Now, we took a lot of drugs. Because I didn't realize until years later that Owsley was inventing all these things. And we used to take Sandoz LSD, which was pharmaceutical from Switzerland. All you guys are academics. I know you don't do any bad things in your life. Yeah, right. Because one thing we did, we went out and played every college in America, so we know them all. When I called my mother, I said, Mom, I'm at Yale, I'm at Woolsey Hall, we're doing a show here. She said, you're in jail, son? I said, Yale.
Same thing.
So everybody, they'd come up to us, the students, the cops, everywhere we went. They said, how do we get a job like yours? And I said, I look them over, I go, you couldn't even stay up as long as we stay up. We don't eat, we don't sleep, we just do the shows and we work all the time. So we began to build this. We built every piece of this took about 10 years to get to this point. We said PAs were so inadequate, so we started doing this. Now, who did this? Ramrod and Johnny Hagan and Rex Jackson, they were born up in Eastern Oregon, in Echo, Hermiston, these tiny little towns. They were true cowboys. And the big thing up there was the Pendleton Roundup. The rest of us, the other three of us, were city boys from Chicago, New York, and Alameda. And we got together all over this thing at Alembic. Alembic was Owsley's studios, and he was like an alchemical guy. He was trying to make gold from lead and other things. That was only one thing he did. So I never told you this, Mr. Kammen, but Owsley used to take an experiment on us, right? So he would take a jar, a mason jar, and he'd pour these bottles in, and it was a clear liquid, and he'd take a long stick of a Q-tip, but with the Q-tip part on top, We'd make a hole and we'd stick it down there, and this thing grew on it overnight, this mold. It was DMT. And whenever we lit that up at the shows, we'd be behind the amps. And Winterland and the Fillmore in those days, it was crazy. It was behind the green door. See, Bill Graham, he never let the police in there, so we ran wild in these places. And everybody was high. And so we tried to lift off the ground. We were hoping that we could make a place, everybody got high enough and we'd take off in a spaceship and say goodbye to Earth. So we end up, as crazy as it sounds, we build this thing that's now taken over the whole world. Everybody comes to us, they want to know, how did you guys do it? It took a long time, and every one of these wooden cabinets was 14 plies of finished plywood. Finland came from. And you bought them at McBee's Hardware in Berkeley. And anyway, Jerry realized, he said, at that time, to go out across America and smoke weed like we did, grow our hair long, you were fighting everybody. The cops were after us. The stagehands union didn't like it. They said, what, you got all this stuff for rock and roll? That don't make any sense. We ain't touching it, and you ain't touching it either. So we get in these beefs with everybody. The DEA was after us for drugs. The FBI was after us for the Hells Angels, following us everywhere, because after Altamont, we stayed friends with them, and nobody else did. Anyway, I digress, I'm sorry. It's a big subject. So as I go on for years, my career is still going on with these guys. I have a radio show on the Grateful Dead channel, and people call up and they ask every detail of
The
our lives.
number one show, I want you to know I'm serious. Yeah, number one show. Yeah.
And I've had him on the show, that's how bad it is. We had fun though, we always had fun. And so in my travels with him, we had some ideas to make products that were building products of other things, and so he introduces me to Dan. Little did I know at the time that deep inside him was growing something, just like that DMT in the jar. And so I start looking and learning about him. Dave's telling me about him. He's a Nobel laureate, I believe. Is that true?
Question.
I want to see that. I want to see the thing. And so
I got the name.
I start realizing that he's a very nice person too. And I go, when Dave tells me that he had gone to a show when he was in Cornell, at this one show, of all the shows we did, so many, more than anybody, there was a show in 1977 at Barton Hall at Cornell. And people, the Deadheads, just decided that was the apex of the Grateful Dead playing. That whole year was so busy. I said to myself, what are they talking about? Every show was great. I never worked at a bad show with these guys. And so I find out that he was at that show, and it changed him. It rewired his brain. Thank goodness. And so this is a sacred task to us. This was our altar, the stage. And we built, I can tell you what every one of these things is. We built everything with our own two hands. And 4 of us put it up and down. And there was about a few other people, truck drivers and stuff like that, you know. It was iron men and wooden cabinets, you know, like those days. And so we went around the world with this thing. We took it to Europe, that was crazy. Didn't work at all, trying to do that. And we were famous in the world of doing everything different in the Grateful Dead. So now, Dave's telling me more stuff about Mr. King. And that he's bragging in 1988, he wired one of our shows up. And I knew he's probably lying, Dave. Everybody tells you that I work for the Grateful Dead. I said, what'd you do? Well, I brought a hot dog to Jerry one time. Come on, man. And so I thought, with skepticism, I thought about it. But then when I started understanding a little more, and he explained what he had done, he was only partially lying. And that's a good thing, because he didn't all out lie and say things that weren't possible. Because we did have to use people to help us on stuff all the time. was we invented what they call delay towers for those giant shows. Watkins Glen was the biggest show ever. And all these places, there was no, it was so crazy. So to get through a show every day, we were so happy. Our day started at 6 a.m. and we worked all day until 4 in the morning. And then we barely slept and went to the next town. So it's an incredible lifestyle. And for him to think that his academic ass can fit in our fucking roadie ass. Can you see him fighting a cop right now? Can you see him putting handcuffs on himself and saying, "Take me away"?
There was no ties back then. It was the actual hand.
Exactly. Exactly. That's a clue that he might have been there. And so, this amazing life we're living. And so we were very protective of it. Ramrod, his real name was Larry Shirtliff, but that's another story. We knew everything about each other. We lived together. Every day we rehearsed. I had both bands with Jerry Garcia, so we was constantly working all the time. I don't know how he ended up with a wife and 4 grandkids. This woman is incredible.
Congratulations, Marilyn.
So now to get to the crux of the matter. So I start to realize, talking to my good friend Dave, there's really something to this. And he tells me, well, guess what? He's moving from Berkeley to Johns Hopkins. I said, what?
Exactly.
Does he know he's going to Baltimore?
That's exactly right, Steve.
Exactly.
That's exactly right.
It's like drunk colleagues that should not talk.
Dan, if you've been with us when first time we played Baltimore at the Civic Center there, the Holiday Inn was right next door. It was insane playing in a hotel, staying in a hotel right next to the show. We never got any rest. And in that place, they had a flag that you had to salute. Everybody had to do, Pledge of Allegiance before the show and sing the Star Spangled Banner. It was really in its own little niche of time and history. Anyway, I could talk for hours and hours about this, but I'm not going to. So Dave and I start thinking about all this whole thing. You come up here, Dan. Come over to me right now. I'm teasing him a little bit. But I want to tell you how special it is. Because of all the years and all the places we went and all of the things we did, we didn't let people in our inner circle. Tonight, because everybody else is dead, I can do that. All the other three guys are dead. I'm sorry, Railroad. This is what we got.
It's a long way down from Jerry to the road.
Survivor Club.
He would have been a gopher. Go for this, go for that. And the thing is that he has the right attitude of a roadie. His brain is smaller than his arms.
Very small.
Yeah, well, we have to all measure ourselves by something. I'm not going to go to other places, but
Hand size.
you got to understand, when we weren't working like animals, we were partying like animals too. And that's where he came in. I'm giving him a bad time.
Keep it going, Steve.
Keep
Now,
going.
hold on.
Keep going. Keep going.
If I had somebody to back me up, Dave is letting me down right now. He should have already changed this.
I do want to go back to some on the energy side.
They're going to think we don't know what we're doing.
Yeah, we know what we're
Well,
doing. So let's go. I want
fake it till you make it.
to give you some data on this, right? So there's 600.
Hold on, 75 tons is what it all weighed.
Okay, wait, 75 tons. Okay.
There was 70 Macintosh 2300
Amps. Yeah.
solid state,
Amps.
and they weigh about 250 pounds
Right.
each.
There's 600 JBL speakers.
And they never gave us one for free.
That's why you went to Meyer Sound.
No,
That's why you went to Meyer
this is
Sound.
really, we only had one drummer at the time.
Yeah.
This was the center console right here.
Where was Jerry's rack? Where
Right
was
here.
Jerry?
Yeah, right there on the side.
Jerry.
Going up the side. See, the whole thing was
Near the
based-
taper section.
Near
The
the
wires
taper-
I had
all
the
the-
string.
Yeah, this is another one.
That's really where he started in the taper thing. That's the shittiest job we can get. He was worthy. So let me just tell you something.
Okay, go.
The reason it was 35 feet tall is because Owsley insisted that a standing bass wave is 35 feet. So when Phil would play his bass, it actually, we did that.
So, and to that.
People shit their pants, yes,
Yeah,
Dave. They did.
So what I want to say is that this was the first notation on socially just music distribution, because they had delays. So Jerry's concept was, I don't care if I'm sitting fucking here.
There's so much that you're missing. Horatio, in your philosophy, you're missing so much.
Phil, what I'm not doing.
Listen
Go
to me,
ahead.
because Ozzy was a genius. You see, when you have, Dave, when you take a speaker and you put a microphone facing it, this is what we were doing here. Incorporating the PA with the band's equipment.
Okay.
So the audience would hear what the band was hearing, you see. Nobody else tried this ever. But the problem was feedback.
Right.
You
Right
see?
down here.
Exactly.
Right here.
So Owsley came up with the idea to take two microphones and put them out of phase with each other, and that canceled the feedback.
Wow.
Then we had another problem, that was leakage. So when the guys would stand out there singing, the mics, they'd come off the mics, they were still on, and so the drums would leak in there, and it was a mess. You couldn't hear everything. Then we said, wait a minute. When you walk into a hardware store in those days, there was a pad that would ring in the back room, so the guy would know, quit counting nails, and come out and get a customer.
Right.
We took those pads. Don't ask me how we got them. We put XLR plugins on them, and so when the band stepped onto that thing, it turned their mic on. When they stepped off, it shut off. We were geniuses. That's
You
all.
were absolutely.
And we were taking drugs all day long and all night.
So
Ridiculous.
energy consumption was 30,000 watts of RMS. That's
There was 4 monkeys
KGO
on a
radio
bicycle
equivalent.
back here.
right.
KGO.
Yeah. So and the 30,000 watts was continuous. You couldn't have any power surge because it would distort all the speakers simultaneously. So it had to
What,
be
you teach
continuous.
There's drugs on his own.
I'm doing DFT.
Drugs on his
I'm
own.
on DFT. Anyway.
You should be.
So I gotta ask you a question.
Yeah.
Okay, so do I get to speak?
Does anybody want to hear him speak?
Yes.
Or are you sick of
I
his,
need
are you
some
sick of his academic credentials?
So first of all, right, so we were non-union, right? Where I was working.
Oh, no, we weren't.
I was.
You were.
I was. I know
That's
you.
why you couldn't
Yeah.
pass the next barrier.
Well, that's good. Okay, so when I was stringing wires and dragging them on the Orono Speedway in Maine, do you remember how we used to check if the line was live?
Of course.
We
We had
pissed
a guy
on
like
it.
you
Right.
bite into the
No,
wire and get
no.
shot. It was live.
So, guys in my crew used to piss on the line.
Don't tell me that.
That is true. And if the guy got flown back and his willy was flying in the air, then we said, oh, that line's live.
This is why we didn't have anybody helping us. Ever.
That was a
Because of
standard
these things that
thing to
people
do.
see. You see,
Standard.
when you get somebody like him who's been, at a desk and working in colleges and schools, he comes out into our real world and
You gotta pee on your line.
You gotta pee on the line.
That's what we did. That's
Because that
what we
makes
did.
sense.
I understand
boy.
conductivity and
Now.
ions. Okay.
Since
And this was a microgrid, if you think about it.
It was a microgrid.
30,000
But
watts.
right here, this is my domain.
Okay,
The
what-
taper section
but hold
worked.
on.
Right here, tell them about
first
the
time-
taper.
the first time, I will, I'll get to that in a
John,
second.
what
The
kind of
first
John?
time we ever set the wall
Yeah.
up was in Pyramid Lake in Nevada. It's up by Washoe County. It's Washoe County outside Reno. It wasn't. And so the wind, the Washoe Zephyr comes up right after sound check. And we have a full audience of people. And we turn this thing on. And you could stand right in front of it and you could not hear the band. And the whole day long, people in the audience were going, "Wait, we can't hear them." And the band was realizing that something was really wrong. So I was standing on the back of the stage, and here comes a farmer on a tractor. And he goes, "Will you shut that damn thing off, man? I'm 7 miles down the road here, and I'm hearing the show." It blew it right there. I realized that wind power was stronger than what we were putting out.
Despite what Mr. Trump thinks.
Wait,
wind power-
wind power works.
Is that another friend of yours? You want him to be a roadie?
No, we had our little battle.
Yeah,
And
he's
by the
never.
way, on KCBS this week, you heard him. He changed into JHU this week on that interview on Quinn Valley.
Beautiful.
You gotta do the branding, come on.
Dave, let's not waste, I think we should get the other thing
Yeah,
out.
let me take this off.
I want to give him something else while you're getting
Okay, well,
going.
you do that, and I'll get.
So
to the next
because
one.
you had the courage to do what you did, you're the only person I've been doing this for in my whole life. Because it's a sacred honor. It's really sacred, because we have one thing, to be strong enough to get the show on. And you illustrated that in every way. I didn't know the right word. And so I brought you a few things. And so we're now gonna make him an official member of the Grateful Dead crew.
Oh, I never got
This package right here is my own memorabilia.
Oh my gosh, direct from the 70s.
And first of all, we pin you with this. You're getting your own laminate from the 1988 tour. That's real good.
That's the year he said he worked.
He said-
Yes, he said he worked.
Allegedly.
Allegedly worked. Allegedly
Yeah,
worked.
right.
Yeah.
I haven't seen these in so damn long. Oh my gosh, I have not
Now,
seen
every
these.
good roadie needs a meal ticket or you ain't gonna eat that. That's what we're in here for.
Look at that, all right.
And now here is the whole tour, the passes
Yep.
from 1988 tour.
Orno Speedway,
No, they're all in there.
Worcester Central.
We have to give some to the groupies, I'm sorry, he doesn't know about that.
Yeah.
Well, I was
And
below
here's
the
a Grateful
roadies.
Dead envelope to keep them in mind too.
I've not seen these.
But I've been going through all my lifetime, I collected everything.
So
And-
now, you want.
Sure, take it off. So here's something that Dave and I came up with for you.
Yeah.
Oh, gee.
And this is a gold record.
Platinum.
Platinum, even better, even better. You know, the first one I got, it fell off my wall in Mill Valley, and I played the record, and it was a Johnny Cash record. I said, I thought it would be a Grateful Dead record, man. But it isn't. It's whatever they got, and whatever they can spray paint. Now this is where we came up, Dave and I came up with this, and we engraved it to you.
Oh my God. Oh my.
Why don't you read it to everybody?
Why don't you read
All
it?
right. Dan Kammen, questionable. HOF Hall of Fame, Grateful Dead roadie. Oh my God.
Yes.
Yes.
You want to believe that? Yes.
Hey, tell him how roadie is spelled, because he won't get that.
Well, when I first saw it, I thought it was spelled wrong, but Dave had looked it up in the dictionary, and that is the correct spelling. We used to call ourselves equipment handlers,
Right.
and we didn't like roadie. That was what the British groups called their guys. And so
We talked about this.
we
You
got
did,
into it.
Fraser. Okay.
At the Capitol Theater in Portchester, when that first opened, I forget the name of NRBQ band.
Right.
They were opening, they had British roadies, and we got into it. And then we said, you know what, maybe roadie's okay, because it is what we are. And we didn't give a hang, really. We didn't care. Nobody was calling us anything nice anyway.
That's right.
So, in order to say that I gave you that, you
That is
are
amazing.
truly a member of the crew now, so you don't have to lie about
I
it.
don't have to lie anymore. Right?
You stated on your resume.
You can
And
put it
you've
on your
done
resume.
Over and over and over
You can
again.
put it on
Okay.
your resume.
Yeah.
I am definitely taking pictures because this is way
Way
more.
beyond your praise pay
Wait,
grade.
Dave, scoot on in here. This is absolutely amazing. Dave is like doing something over there.
Okay.
There we
Gotta
go.
keep your eye on that.
I haven't seen one of these. This is totally amazing. I cannot
Don't you
believe
love
it.
this? I mean, yeah, this is really good.
This is
And the
unbelievable.
whole color scheme, the whole goddamn thing.
I know it's the
You
paisley.
gotta thank
we got
Tom,
the-
did a great job. on
Tom
that.
did a great
I
job.
knew he would do it.
Yeah,
Unbelievable.
yeah. And we were gonna go gold, but we thought, Steve and I thought,
Yeah.
we should go.
Let's go to the
Let's
top.
This is
elevate
dead.
it.
This is
Let's
dead.
elevate
There's a
it
lot
up.
more
Elevate it up.
So I do got to add one story. You can tell me if it's off. So,
Okay.
my one summer doing roadie work for the dead, we followed.
Is that your phone?
So
It's out.
in these high end places, Orno Speedway and the Worcester Centrum and this and that, we always followed. I don't know who booked this crap. 48, 72 hours after Van Halen's Monsters of Rock tour. The one thing you do not want to do is try to string wires in a place where Van Halen has just been. Because the things you find are unbelievable. Let's just say latrines are a thing so far beyond what they were thinking about. It was unbelievable. So we had to string wire, and people were like, let's string another 30 foot of cable because we don't want to go anywhere near. And every now and then there would be like a movement, like an arm would come up or something. And it was.
But that's all part of being a roadie because you go into a lot of places, you know.
No one told me that was being a
circus. In those
roadie.
days, the circus has been there before us, and that's even worse. You know, because have you ever seen?
I thought that Eddie Van Halen.
Forget
was
about
already
human
enough.
shit. Look at elephant shit, man. Anyway, the thing is this: that you have to get down and dirty to be a roadie. That's the truth. In the Boston Garden, which was so old and so revered, the rats were this big under the stage. You had to fight them as you drug in the AC.
And do you remember that staircase on the outside you had to climb up to get to the top? That was.
I didn't have to climb.
Oh, I had to climb that staircase. That was scary.
That's what the beauty of being the stage man.
This is like.
Hey, send that guy Kammen up there, man. Tell him to wave that little flag when everybody will know he's up there.
Oh my
But
goodness.
now you got to change yourself a little bit. You got to start acting with dignity.
I got new pants. I bought new pants for tonight.
Good.
You
That's a
should
good
get
step
back
in the
up,
right
right?
direction.
See, these
That
are
makes you
new.
more road
No
running than you
pants.
know, man. Having new pants is very important. Because sometimes on the road you need a second pair.
Anything can be turned inside out twice.
We could go on for hours, but I'm going to shut up and
Do
let
they
you
have
talk.
any questions?
Oh,
Just-
yeah, questions.
Does anyone have a question about the authenticity of Dan working for the Grateful Dead at this point?
Yeah, you got a problem with that?
I mean,
You got
does
a
anyone
problem?
have a problem with it?
I think we're convinced.
Okay,
Oh,
good.
you don't get to take this. We can't trust you.
So Dan, on the back is a whole bunch of stuff. That's also part of.
Oh yeah, this is your life story.
This is your life
This is your
story.
life, Dan.
Oh, this picture.
This is your picture that I found, that where you're again talking about the Grateful Dead. It's just on and on.
Of course, I just go, right?
You know, he hid this so well when I first met him. He never said a word about it.
No, he was afraid to.
And, oh, I got it.
'Cause you
I've been his
are.
boss for half
That's
time.
right. Because 1988 was not a great year for the Dead.
1988?
88. Jerry wasn't performing. We got 45
Oh,
minutes.
now he's a
Space Jam.
critic. Oh my
Oh,
goodness.
no!
Oh, excuse me, Dan. No. Oh my God. I didn't know. You're
Take it
You
back.
know what? You
Roadies,
Take this back.
little big
It's
bird.
not worthy. It's not worthy.
No, let me tell you, the first time when the band came off stage, I said, wow, that was great. Jerry says to me, shut up, man. Why don't you tell Weir to play the right song?
That's the
Once
song
you do
we
this,
had.
so you keep your mouth shut, and you're not a critic. Hey, guys, you're late.
Oh,
So I got to ask you a question.
oh, you're so late.
Yes, I smoke pot, and I haven't had some in a while. My THC
So it
levels
doesn't
are
have to be a single one, but favorite song
St. Stephen, what do you think?
or friend.
Well, that tells a lot about you. That was written about bums.
I know it was.
Wherever we go, Jerry loved. He'd
I would love
see that
Warfare.
down and out guy. And he'd say, "Hey, here's a cigarette, man." All that, you know.
I ain't got
It never
time.
turned out right. It never turned out right. Yeah, exactly.
That was a great song.
But
Still
St.
is a great
Stephen
song.
was my song,
That's a good
and
song.
Hunter was a great writer, you know, and he would write about what happened to us, you know. I mean, you couldn't have done this, but when the song Cassidy, we were all living up in Nicasio at Rucker Ranch, and just me and Weir were there that day, and Eileen comes out of the teepee and she goes, "Man, look at my baby!" She's standing there naked, and so I go, I said, "Bob, we gotta help her. Come up and help me." I go up there,
You
and
gotta write a
she's
song.
already, the baby was coming out, and I said, "What kind of a job do I have, man?" I'd never seen a baby's head come out of a woman before. I don't know why, but I was 18 at the time, and so I was holding her hand and doing everything. And
You better look over here. You're getting some.
This is
strong
ER
stares.
doctor.
She's heard way worse, trust me.
Okay. All right.
But this is not a bad story. That's where the song was written, right there. Weir was writing that song. and playing it.
Instead of helping,
And so if you listen to the words, Hunter would write us into the song. You know, so I was driving a '51 Cadillac that day, and it's in the song, the whole story. But the Grateful Dead, you had to do stuff like that. You had to try every drug that came around. You had to try everything, and you had to deliver babies if it happened at the show. And you also had to be somebody who constantly fought the world to get these guys on stage safely.
Standing upright.
So I'm
Standing
proud of
upright.
them.
Standing upright.
And you now represent that, so don't fuck up.
If I had a second chance to be a roadie for him, I would do it again.
When the Hells Angels took me to the clubhouse the first time, they said, "Come to a party. If you get in a fight with somebody, you better be right."
That's right.
Because we're not
One knife,
fight
you
that
won't get
guy.
enough.
You better be right.
No, jeez.
So you have an honor now that no one else in the world has. And you can tell people you work with us and then have them call you.
Okay, I will.
And I'll say,
As
"That's
a
nuts.
reference.
Is that nuts? Don't
That's
tell
a
her."
reference. This is your reference.
When I need to be promoted or not, I'm coming to you.
Any of you people ever been to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania? Sure?
Yeah.
I don't believe you. Anyway, so we played at the Spectrum there. And the first time we ever played there, it just opened, brand new. And so this guy's hanging around. He's in a suit and everything. And he was, his name was Bob Board, and he was the assistant DA of Philadelphia. And he had the same thing, like so many people have, he wanted to be part of the Grateful Dead. And so he started hanging out with us a little bit that day, but you knew that he had taken some psychedelic because later you saw him, his shirt was off, his pants were ripped apart, and he's dancing with girls out there in the audience and just losing his mind. He got fired soon after that, and he followed us around the world. And so at Stinson Beach where we lived, Jerry called me up and said, "Steve, get up here, you won't believe this." He had sent a whole moving truck with all his stuff up to Jerry's house. And we're trying to convince this guy that we're not taking it. It's not belongs here. It's his stuff. For years, I hear him yelling at me when we played Philadelphia. "Where's my fucking cat?" He sent his cat to Jerry's house too. So now you got to deal with all that.
You got a lot of responsibility, Dan.
I think this is I'm not worthy moment. That's what I think.
No, you're gonna make a nice speech now about how honored you are.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow. That is oh my goodness. And I have not seen these since that year.
Well, that's why I brought them.
That's why Steve
thought
brought
about that.
Unbelievable.
Steve has it.
I'm the only one that has those, and
Yeah.
I thought you'd appreciate
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna find you one right for that show at Worcester's in there. The Worcester
Yeah.
show is in there.
Well, I string wires. I have to string around a huge
Because
cesspool.
I spent the whole day trying to find a Boston show because he said it was in Boston.
I thought it was in Boston.
It
but
was
it
a
wasn't.
little
It
out
was
of town.
Worcester, and then we went to Worcester to Orono,
Or no, okay.
and then we went to this weird place. It wasn't even a theater in Rockport, Massachusetts,
Okay,
and it was a mess.
okay.
So
Yeah.
I cannot believe you guys let us indulge this trip down the drug-fused memory lane. But I think, I don't know for sure.
Don't
I know
point
I
at me
was.
like that, man.
What's that?
I bet these people think I did something.
No, and at least for that summer, I know I was the only PhD working for the dead. I
Is
don't
that
know
true?
other summers.
Steve, there's gotta be other PhDs.
That's
Well, hold
88.
on,
No.
hold on, buddy.
What
I'm
about
a
the
street
DNA
surgeon.
guy?
I'm a street surgeon,
Okay.
self-trained.
Right.
Once I realized that we didn't have any money for doctors, we
Right.
had to take care of ourselves.
That'd be the holistic mushrooms.
And when you get hurt on the street, you got to reach up into the heart cavity and not be afraid. My dad told me, "It's just plumbing, son. It's just plumbing. Everything's plumbing. Remember that." And he was right.
This is the organic
So-
mechanic.
And it was weird, and I, at the hotel, you know, we have all these hours after the show, and you can't sleep after you've been working all day like that. And so we would experiment with each other. We took Jerry's brain out one night, and we found out we had to go all night. I said, "I got it." Because the markets were open all night in the big cities. So I got 100 chickens and brought them back to the hotel. And we realized that in series, you could put 100 chicken brains in a human skull, and it's just fine. You can't
Like counting beans in the jar, is that what? So this is way beyond what we did.
We never tell these stories, but I'm telling them now because you're part of the crew.
I do want to, does anyone have any questions in regards to Dan or
Anything.
Steve?
Come on.
Anything. Yeah.
They got
I just-
questions.
I will make one
They got
comment.
questions, I can
I
tell,
think
but they're
Dan got-
decent people. They don't want
This
to
This
ask
is
us.
cool. And the frame is unbelievable.
It's skulls.
I know, it's
Yeah, and
unbelievable.
by the way, they're the red bullets. How many, teeth, the bullets. So Steve and I are.
So you've seen my car, right? My Tesla?
Yes.
With the Grateful Dead stickers on the
Yes.
two sides?
Yes, yes. But this is where microgrids have, well, the wall of
With
sound.
the wall of sound is where-
That is a microgrid. And I'm convinced that's what got Dan going.
That's
It
right.
is. I think it is.
30,000 watts of microgrid standalone because the show could not
This will
stop.
power the whole town. I want to open a university in Millennium.
Oh.
More power than they have.
Well, then Steve will open the show.
All right, so Steve,
Yeah.
I'm bringing you over.
Of course.
Yeah.
Now
Any
we're bound-
questions?
Or roasts.
Oh, Claudia.
Just a comment. Actually, this is extremely interesting, the wall of sound. Extremely interesting.
I can tell you a lot more about it, you know, I mean, what I was trying to say earlier.
It's socially just now. That's how I look at it.
First, we had
Yeah.
these all individual 5-inch speakers, and so it was really difficult to sandwich them together between these two boards. These tweeters up here were very heavy. This thing is suspended on 3 2-ton motors.
Try running the wires out of the back of that shit, too.
Yeah.
And we
He's
can let
sibling.
nobody touch that.
You're sibling. This is why you got the sign.
You're not
from-
supposed to lie
That's why you
anymore.
got the sign. Yeah, you're
Oh, it
sibling.
was easy. Sorry, it was really easy.
Easy, yeah.
I'll show you what the back of it looked like. Not many people ever saw it. And it was really hard for them to get our attention because it was so solid like this, you couldn't see them. So I figured out, I put a switch out there and a light bulb. And so when that light bulb went on, we knew they had some problem, we'd go out there. But this is the thing that you don't understand. When Jerry's guitar, or anybody's guitar breaks, you're 50,000 people in the stadium. You don't go out there, and you can do whatever you want in the Grateful Dead. If you wanted to wake up and get drunk in the morning, nobody said anything.
It had to work.
Do anything you wanted, but you were no good by noon if you did that stupid stuff. So we only smoked weed all day long. We go out there and fix everything that was broken. It didn't, you were able to understand it. We lived in an electric world at this time. Everything was electric. That's what we call the LSD, electricity, because nobody knows what it does to your body. It's odorless, tasteless, and a clear liquid. So,
Dr.
we called it
Madoni.
electrify my spirit, please. And when you touch,
Our physician
nothing
was Timothy
grounded.
Leary, by the way.
Nothing was grounded in Woodstock. Nothing was grounded, and that's why you'll never see Grateful Dead in Woodstock.
That's why we peed on the wires. Yeah. That's how we figured it out.
Let me tell you something. Now,
There's
you're
no-
voting. The first thing you gotta do,
Just be humble.
take your guy's guitar when you plug it in, he's stuck.
I don't think I ever touched
You
a
have to
guitar.
walk out and touch it to
If
him.
I ever touched it.
He isn't
I don't
even
think I ever touched a guitar.
You never, I was just gonna teach you how, but I'm not going to. But when you see an arc jump from the guitar to that, you know it's gonna knock somebody out. And that night, it was raining in Woodstock, they went on at like 3:30 in the morning. And, because nobody understood that we had to stay on schedule, it was so new to everybody. And so the shots they got, Jerry's lips swelled up like that, and Bobby too, so they'd never allowed to be in the movie. Santana, who was a good friend of ours, after Woodstock, he made it to #1. Herbie was
Herbie,
for
yeah.
those guys, and they were our buddies, you know.
Yeah.
But,
And you heard the most epic Jimi Hendrix show. of all
oh
time.
yeah.
Yeah.
All
That's the night he lit his guitar on fire and
Yeah.
everything.
That was the most amazing thing I've ever.
Yeah.
Of course, I wasn't there, but I saw it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, we did some other things with him. He was interesting.
Any other questions?
I was gonna tell her what everything was in there.
Please drink and eat more.
Yeah, eat more, yeah.
And I cannot thank you guys. I can't thank everybody enough for coming. So, but thank you. And thank you for the double timers who did last night's version and had the patience to do tonight. Thank That is unbelievable.
Guy, artist, and it was amazing.
That is absolutely.